Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to the latest installment in the Black Hat webinar series, Defeating the Dangers of a Data Breach, Top Strategies to Get Your Organization Ahead of a Data Security Incident, brought to you by CIRA, Black Hat, and Informa. I'm Steve Paul with Black Hat. I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, and later in the program, we'll ask for your feedback. We strongly encourage participation and are happy to take your questions and comments. You can participate in our Q&A session by asking questions at any time. Just type them into the Ask a Question text box in the bottom of our console. We'll answer as many questions as time permits after our presentations. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and PDF copies of our presentations can be found in the resource box in the bottom of our console. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. If you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the help ? Icon on the bottom of our console. And if slides are not advancing, please press the F5 key on your keyboard to refresh your browser. And now on to our presentation, Defeating the Dangers of a Data Breach. Top strategies to get your organization ahead of a data security incident. Discussing today's presentation is first Adam Strange, Principal Analyst, Data Security with Omdia. And then we'll hear from our sponsor presenter, Lamont Orange, Chief Information Security Officer with CIRA. And now first, over to Adam.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. It's always great to have these opportunities. So thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank you to Black Hat. Thank you to CIRA as well for the opportunity again. So I guess in terms of today's agenda, one of the key measures I think that can be taken in terms of mitigating the threat from inside and outside is really kind of looking at that sort of DSPM piece, the data security posture management. And I'll take a few moments really to kind of explore how DSPM has really risen quite meteorically actually over the past year or so. But I wanted really just to sort of start things off by a little bit of sort of scene setting in terms of data security as a whole. Obviously, in terms of today's agenda, how Omdia kind of researches and reports on data breaches worldwide. So we'll look at some of the trends around sort of that piece, and obviously then the growth really of data security as a whole, really as a kind of an autonomous but obviously related part of the cybersecurity equation. We'll look at DSPM in terms of a robust platform for data security. And then I'll offer you some summary, some notes and some takeaways towards the end of the 20 minutes or so. So diving straight in, the evolution of data security. Data security really has emerged, I think, probably over the last couple of years, certainly, as a separate sort of cybersecurity discipline, or at least a cybersecurity discipline in its own right. It's very much now a focus area, whereas I think it was perhaps sort of more involved in a wider kind of approach to keeping the perpetrators, the malicious actors outside the network. So the defensive strategy was very much focused on the periphery of the network. Now, I think, perhaps regrettably, we have to acknowledge that the hackers can make their way inside a network, and so therefore, taking separate measures around specific areas of a network and infrastructure is absolutely the way forward, and data security really is one of those. So why has it emerged kind of front and center? I think, if we look at the data breaches, so this is information from Omdia's own ongoing kind of research around data breaches. We've tracked it really from 2019 So about 5 years or so worth of data. And looking at that left-hand chart, it's just worth pointing out straight away that 2024, obviously we're reporting in terms of Q1 only. But I think if you extrapolate that out, sort of multiply it by 4, we can see that we'll be at or above the figures for 2023. Yes, we did see a bit of a dip in 2021, 2022, but 2023 was resurgent again, and I see no reason why 2024 shouldn't be, at or about that same sort of figure, as I say. For 2023, we can have a look at some of the statistics, really. 71% resulted in data exposure, and we'll see that in a chart later on. But it's the malicious attacks, really, which are the mainstay of the breaches. 83% in 2023, up from 70%, in 2019. The chart on the right-hand side, overwhelmingly, the Americas is kind of the main area which receives those attacks. Europe in second place. So 61% of all attacks through the sort of the 5 years that we've tracked are occurring in the Americas, and it's a long way ahead, really, of Europe and indeed Asia, Oceania, in second place. So you can see the numbers really in terms of how that relates to totals on an annual basis. So fairly stark, really, in terms of the number of breaches, certainly in the Americas. Drilling down by method of breach, hacking overwhelmingly is the most popular, if that's the right word, mechanism. Nigh on half of the attacks are outright theft of information, but there's a whole a raft of others as well that we need to be aware of, from accidental exposure and actually ransomware. Although you could argue it is hacking, we break out ransomware specifically if there is a request for or a demand for a specific ransom. So that's why that's a separate categorization. Phishing, again, supply chain. These are all areas that now encounter breaches, and all areas that actually need that sort of mitigation effort, in terms of trying to defeat the threat. If we look at industry, not surprisingly, perhaps government and healthcare are out front in terms of the number of breaches recorded. IT, reasonably close, sort of third place, and those three, comfortably ahead of all of the other industry verticals. Professional services, I guess, is the next one, and then more or less the same sort of level of breaches by industry. So it's not necessarily one specific area beyond government or specifically healthcare, IT, etc., that really stands out in terms of those. They're more or less the same sort of number across the board. Quite interesting if you look at life sciences, actually in the middle there, that's quite so low. I would have expected that to be quite a lot higher, given that that's pharmaceutical as well. But, evidently not necessarily the case, certainly in terms of our research anyway. So, as I said earlier, data security is evolving. It's really evolved into this sort of separate cybersecurity discipline. We've had a look and sort of seen the increased threat landscape, but there's other things to work into this discussion as well. The increasing prevalence of data privacy legislation, around about 137, 140 or so of nigh on 200 countries now have or are implementing their own data privacy laws. So, this is really sort of picked up a pace over the past few years, really, I suppose, since 2018 and the advent of GDPR over here in EMEA. There is at the moment an ongoing need to intensify and better protect data. we live in a world of distributed networks. I guess cloud could be thrown in there. We now work from home. And all of this really sort of expands that attack surface, all of which needs to be managed to keep the malicious actors out. And it can be quite a challenge really to identify, the full scope of that landscape. And again, really, it's just simply good business practice. We all know that we need to protect data when we take on our roles. We know that we can and we can't distribute information. Some of it's sensitive, some of it's confidential, some of which is publicly accessible and absolutely no risk to the business whatsoever. But we know that there are some some restraints, some boundaries, and so on that we can't go beyond. And this is entirely the case, really, in the digital environment as much as it is in perhaps a sort of more traditional sense. So, just maintaining that good business practice, protecting data in the right way in a digital environment, entirely the same way that we would if we were protecting sort of paper-based information. A couple more kind of pieces of research in terms of backing up the evolution of data security. If we look at the way that businesses have changed their approach to data security posture within the last year or so, we can see some significant kind of focus efforts in terms of changing the way that data security has been managed. Startling figures, I think, perhaps at the top, that where significant investment has been put in, or significant change has been put in to reevaluate, rework, refocus on data security specifically. And if we kind of put the two bars together, 82% of people are changing the way, substantially changing the way that they work their data security posture. The chart on the right, I just wanted to put in there because I think it shows quite an interesting new development. We've got the various sort of drivers in terms of data security and what sort of instigates that purchasing decision. Theft or protection against theft and data loss. Yes, I think that's probably to be expected. Prevention of accidental leakage and that sort of thing. I think these are perhaps kind of quite obvious. But I think one of the startling stats in that particular chart is that second bar, the 45% who are now sort of expressing some sort of reservations around the financial impact of regulatory penalties. And certainly in GDPR or under GDPR, I think about 4.6 billion euros worth of fines have now been levied. So it's a substantial element now of the whole kind of notion of needing to do more to protect data specifically. Returning just briefly to the breaches tracker, we can see again how this sort of data exposure is really sort of a significant part of the breaches. Substantially more than any other of the sort of the categorization there. System failure, yes, but it's really that sort of data exposure piece which is really a substantial part of the breaches. And then on the right-hand side, share of breaches by source, well, again, overwhelmingly, this is around malicious actors, malicious intent. There is a piece of kind of negligence and sort of poor operational behavior, perhaps, but the lion's share really is malicious actors seeking to exfiltrate data in an obviously an unauthorized way. So, quite a heavy sway towards this sort of malicious intent piece there. So measures to kind of mitigate all of that, I think. As I said in my intro, DSPM really has become the mainstay of the new approach to a new paradigm, really, in terms of the need for enhanced data security. But what is DSPM? I think there are a number of different kind of definitions around DSPM in the marketplace. Some vendors will do pieces of it. Some will deliver the whole shooting match. But for the purposes of today's session, really what I'm talking about is a capability around sort of discovery and categorization, or indeed classification, because the two are different at one end. So finding and understanding your data, then being in a position to protect it through encryption, data masking, tokenization, and so on. Privilege management, access controls, and so on, also part of the mandate of DSPM. But I think it really goes into kind of a kind of the, as it were, the test evaluation, more kind of services orientated piece as well, in terms of how do you, once you've figured out what your data is, who has access to it, and so on, how do you then police it? How do you control it? How do you mitigate risk? And there's some several sort of aspects there: risk assessment, security controls, making sure that there is a kind of a cyclical approach to managing those standards, those protocols that ensure that your standards one day remain in place through the following day and ongoing into the future, so that there is a sort of constant policing of the battlements, if you like. So certainly not a fire and forget, and obviously those that don't patrol their sort of elements of the castle walls do leave themselves exposed. So it is this sort of ongoing process of constant vigilance, constant management, constant updates, to make sure that you're not exposed in any way. So much more of a kind of a holistic way forward, really, as far as data security is concerned. This is what it looks like from a sort of graphical perspective. Discovery at one end, through that sort of monitoring, analysis, and remediation piece at the other. But obviously, as the arrow indicates, this is very much an ongoing process. But really, are there still some missing pieces? I guess DSPM is still relatively in its infancy. So I would argue that there are some pieces missing. And perhaps Lamont can give us a flavour of that going forwards. But I think from a point of view of DSPM, it's very much a proactive kind of proposition. Focuses very much on using best practice to keep the malicious actors out. But should it be reactive as well? Well, we've already talked about that sort of prevention piece, which is the proactive element. But I would argue that there needs to be kind of an element of responsiveness in here. So this is the reactive piece: what to do in the event of an attack. DSPM is good, and it's certainly the right way forward in terms of the robust sort of stance that it provides, but it's not ever going to be 100% kind of guarantees in terms of safety. So what about some additional safeguards in here? I think there are various that can be brought, DDR, for example, DLP. These aren't part of the traditional DSPM construct at the moment. What about remediation plans, communications planning, a test process? There is an element of that in terms of DSPM, but the backup strategy, I think, is really important. How do you get yourself back online using perhaps the sort of classical 3-2-1 strategy? So 3 copies of your data on 2 different media, one remotely cited with that important air gap piece in the middle of it. So I think once there is this element of kind of additional pieces within sort of DSPM, you can see down the bottom how that then begins to form the foundation. I think erasure is also an interesting one. DSPM has a right to be forgotten. And as we sort of work forward from a sort of sustainability and a green agenda, repackaging, recycling, and so on, there has to be a rigorous process of getting rid of data. And it's not enough purely to delete it. It has to be erased properly from the infrastructure. So we can see how this all begins to build out into a much more kind of strong and robust foundation, which we can then build out with some additional threat intelligence, the other areas of the cybersecurity posture. So, endpoint protection, application protection, network security, and so on, infrastructure security, cloud, Internet of Things, and so on. This then delivers a much more secure and usable data source. It's hopefully going to be compliant, although securing data is one thing, making it compliant is potentially another. But actually then, once we've got all of that working in harmony, what we've actually got is a strong and secure data source that we can then use for business planning, business enablement, ultimately for that sort of improved productivity piece. So that's really the important thing, I think, around DSPM. Yes, it's a data security platform, absolutely, but it's also that sort of foundation for what we as sort of employees of organizations actually want, which is a firm foundation for robust planning going forward. So secure data, absolutely, but it's really about that sort of data security and proper planning, proper intelligent planning based on that data. In the knowledge, I guess, that it's all it's appropriate data being used in the right way. So I think that's all I have to say. I will just move over quickly to my summary, which is a slide I forgot. Apologies for that. So anyway, yes, DSPM is about a proactive stance currently. It's certainly the future platform for data security as a whole, but it is still evolving. Not quite yet the final article, and not all vendors are able to deliver that sort of full portfolio that I've been talking about. It does set up that strong foundation for business enablement, as I say, and certainly as far as I'm concerned, there are still a few bits and pieces missing, but hopefully we'll see those build in over time. That's me. Please do reach out if you have any questions. Obviously, put them in the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end of the session. But if you've got any others, then do drop me an email. And that is from me. So, Steve, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, nice job, Adam. Thanks very much for an excellent presentation. Now I'd like to turn it over to our sponsor presenter, Lamont Orange, Chief Information Security Officer with Cyera. So, Lamont, over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Adam, for setting the stage. I think when you really start to look and think about data and how we've had to deal with this for 20 plus years and how we secure it, and we've seen it arrive to a stage where it is the fastest growing attack surface. And it's more or less, what do we do? The one thing that we know is that the threat actors are really informed to understand that we don't necessarily have a grasp of all of our data, where it sits, how it's used, and they want to exploit and take that opportunity to leverage our data, leverage and abuse our security programs. And as we start to focus on this data security problem again, I think we've finally arrived with the right technologies to be able to do it. But we do have some indication that it is the right place and right time, because the vast majority of security programs and security leaders I speak with say we still struggle. I mean, over 60% say we still struggle with the use of data. They say we can't get a proper inventory as well because of this attack surface growing so fast. 50% growth, 2023 to 2025, that's huge. So how can we make sure we have an accurate inventory? And also compliance. Are we in compliance with our contracts? Are we in compliance with the privacy rules and regulations? Are we in compliance with what our customers and what our employees expect of us? And those are very, very tough questions to answer. And security exposures, we see them time and time again, and it still involves the data, it still involves the identity. So when we say that this is the fastest growing attack surface, we think there's opportunity today to actually address those. I want to talk a little bit more about the evolution of security as Adam set the stage for that, and talk a little bit more about the data problem. When you think of what's top of mind for all of your chief information security officers, your data architects, your data leaders, you're really thinking that data's lifeblood of the business at the end of the day. The organization, your businesses, they want to use the data. And most of the time in the security and in the protective disciplines within the organizations, we tend to say no, that we can't use this, but we can use that piece of it. So we have to get to a point where we can enable it, but we also have to manage the opportunities that are presented to the bad actor, because we don't have those inventories and we don't have it classified in the proper manner. So we have to manage that risk. We have to manage the risk of the regulators. The regulators continue to produce more and more mandates around how we should control data. But how do we institute and operationalize that? When you look at today, 87% of the data created in the last 5 years drive modern data use and modern data discovery tool adoption. Because we have to not only understand what's on premise, we have to understand what's also that we put in our cloud, in our public cloud, our private clouds, how we interact with third parties. We have to understand all of that to understand what our risk is and be able to present what that posture is. What controls do we need to have in place versus what controls are not effective? And I think this is where you look to DSPM to be able to provide that information and statistics. But fundamentally, DSPM is a cornerstone in protecting our ability to be able to respond to incidents as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as I go through my presentation. So you've heard me talk about identity in the brief opening as well, that we want to understand who is using this particular data set and where are they using it from. So identities can be in the form of the traditional user identity. It can also be a token. It can be an API key. We want to understand to that level, again, across the entire landscape of who's using that data, to make sure that we understand they're using it appropriately and they're using it effectively for the way the business wants to use it. I got a few more statistics for you. When you look at 57% of the organizations that are looking to address the identity sprawl, that's just in a recent trend of 2004, 57%. We're still looking to solve the identity crisis and problem around how data is used and where it's used. And we have to be able to answer this question, nonetheless, to be able to enable our businesses. The other thing that you look at is 45% of organizations experience a reputational impact when they are involved in an identity incident. It's always coming back to there is an identity or there was a credential of sort that was used. Again, identity being the broader title for what can be a token, what can be a API key, what can be even a secret that has access to that data, or a third party. We have many third parties that today in a connected economy, third parties are contingent workforce for. So we have to give them access to certain data, but we also want to limit the access because historically we've given broader access because we don't know where everything is. And the other one that I like to point and bring to your attention is that 90% of organizations experience an identity incident in the past year. So as you start to think about and draw these correlations of how identity and data are really two sides of the same coin, they're really required to be in platforms that operationalize data security. They are required to be in a position where they can be compared, aggregated, and correlated to get you to a story of what's actually happening in your organization. I think ultimately, when you think about this, there are certain questions that you have to ask yourself, whether it's an IR event or whether it's a data use event or whether it's a just operationalization of how you categorize and discover your data stores. You want to answer the question of where is it, Is it secure? And how do I detect my violations? How do I analyze if I have any access issues? Those are generally the questions that you want. And the foundation for doing that is really being able to discover, inventory, and classify your data. When you look at how this builds upon incident response, you heard me say in the opening statements as well, that accurate and effective data classification and discovery feeds not only your data security program, but it feeds your ability to be able to respond to an incident. And really what I mean by that is that sometimes we're plagued, and when we are encountering an incident, we're plagued by our inability to classify, have accurate data classification. We have the false positives of that data, meaning that we think something is here, we know where it should be, it's in an enclave, it's protected in this area, but during the incident, we find out that that's not the case. And we find out that there's very much a struggle of trying to understand what was actually impacted in the incident, what data was impacted that was triage. We understand what the resource is generally, but we don't know what was all in the resource. We know what was supposed to be in there. And as you go through an incident, you think about the amount of business disruption, technical teams being repurposed to search and categorize data, moving away from what the day-to-day operations of the business is. The actual halt, if it's data that the business uses to propel and operate the business, which in most cases it is, it's an actual halt and stoppage. The innovation aspects that come back to that of the ability to say yes, that you can use this data, and all the friction that we put in place to protect in the name of protection, I'd say, of this data, causing business disruption. So we got to think about that and how not only we answer these challenges for incident response and how it results to data classification, but we also want to understand how we leverage this for operationalization of our data. I think when you talk about outcomes, everyone's into outcome-driven security, outcome-driven business objectives. And I think this is no different. When we all sign up as security leaders, we sign up to protect the data. We comply with whatever the compliance, regulatory, and obligations are for us. We also want to be able to respond. And I know Adam touched on the response piece. And we always want to be able to leverage the data. This is how we say yes. How security says yes to the business, that you can accelerate dependent business processes. You can help with the innovation of the business as the company continues to reinvent itself as a modern company and continue to compete. And you can also look at how security can contribute to top line and bottom line by reducing costs and also more efficiently managing our resources. So first, I want to go back to protect for a second and talk about how we minimize those business risks. One is around, again, the classification. We know what we know generally within our classification paradigms of today. And those are restricted really to maybe 3 or 4 different categories that we can maintain because of the influx of false positives and false negatives that come through with some of those policy violations and the ability of our teams to triage. So there is a better way to detect the data sprawl. There is a better way to identify the access and ensure enforcement of least privilege, which is what we want to get to when we talk about true zero trust. But I think at this point, when you're talking about protection, zero trust tends to leave out the data component. It focuses heavily on the user component and the network component, which is the access component. And again, now I think as we start to redefine what protect means in the lens of data security, we're overlaying what data controls, what data access, what data inventories do we have. And then we move to compliance and understanding what the internal controls are that we set forth in our security program. We also want to improve the preparedness for the audits against the controls that are enforced upon us by regulatory bodies. And also want to understand, again, every company's becoming a global company. If they're not, they want to expand into new markets. How can we ensure that the use of our data and the storage of our data is in compliance with a lot of those new market obligations. And then the burden of proof. Normally, the burden of proof is historically a heavy lift on organizations so that you can prove that, in fact, you do have these security controls and that they are enforced and have been enforced for some time. We also want to be able to respond. And I think this is the area that Adam hit on that really talks about there's more to DSPM, and I totally agree with that. The ability to accelerate the response, the ability to do the policies that will enforce all of our controls, the ability to address the data drift between environments. And as we move from DSPM into data security capabilities, I think this is where you're going to see the most integration. This is a requirement, a table stakes for DSPM providers. And again, I think leverage I've already talked about, but essentially what I want you to take away from that, it is the ability to say yes without all the caveats of yes, but, and yes, maybe, or you can only use these particular components of data. And I think we have to get there and as security programs and data programs in order to actually enable the business to move forward. I want to talk a little bit about the power of DSPM, and I've been hinting around a lot of these things as we talk about it being a core and foundational component of incident response and incident management. And the questions that I started out with, where's my data? Where's all of my data? Well, let's turn that around from a brief scenario to say what data was impacted. When I asked where was my data stored, I can also add to that where was my data accessed. And then what data did it entail? Let's talk about some of that around the materiality. We have to be able to get there pretty quickly instead of weeks, months, days, and in some cases years to understand what data was actually impacted in an unauthorized event or a hacking event. We have to be able to have those details as to what data. And I mean, some of these things are very simple because we hear about data disclosures and breaches in the news and in publications quite often. But one food for thought is to just think about whether you're in Microsoft or whether you're in Google Workspace. If something was to happen with just your executive staff, your E-staff, would you know if in your entire E-staff was compromised, would you know what was compromised for all of those executives? Do you know what data was in those particular OneDrives or Google Drives? Do you know if that data is sensitive or if it's critical or if it's a non-event? These are the things that we have, these are the questions that we have to answer, and how the power of DSPM plus data security and incident response scenario will be able to give you the answers to those questions. Because ultimately we'll be able to define what this data was used for and who had access to it, whether it was human or non-human, which further gets us to how I started this talking about obtaining the materiality of the event. So when I talk about incident response, responding to data security incidents with speed and focus, most important, months, weeks, days, and years are something that we've grown accustomed to, but the regulatory landscape is not accustomed and is not kind to that. They want us to be able to have the analysis, understand the sensitive data discovery, essentially moving into a state of data hunting, to understand what that heat map would look like, but data impacted very hot to data that may be impacted to some of those warm spots. They want us to be able to answer that question in a prioritized manner where we can mitigate the blast radius. Because again, this is the fastest growing attack surface. This new oil has been categorized as many, many things, but we also want to be able to determine the materiality should one of these events occur. So it's very important that we have the right processes, the right tooling, the right resourcing, and we can do it at scale to produce these responses. When you look at responding to an incident, there's always a life cycle as well. And this is where you look at materiality. That's what we first want to determine. We want to remediate and mitigate to meet our resourcing being used efficiently, and also to meet those obligations that we are responsible for. We want to manage the expectations of the business, meaning that we want to close this out as soon as possible as well. We don't want incidents to last forever. So sometimes, given that data is the fastest growing attack surface, and given that we have lots of data stores that we need to go through and identify should an incident happen, and an incident doesn't always translate into a breach. It could be a mishandling or misuse of data by your internal employees, which still maintains the same reporting obligation. So we want to identify the critical data stores. We want to have a way to understand when new data stores are coming online so that we can inventory and classify them appropriately. And we want to classify all the sensitive data agnostically, whether that is in cloud or whether that's on premise. And most importantly, we want to determine that incident blast radius and limit it. So I want to leave you with a couple different things to think about. When you talk about active monitoring, detection, and response insights, again, when you listen to what Adam talked about, some of the things that were missing within what DSPM and how it's defined today, I will argue that these capabilities are now available to us, where we can talk about sensitive data that was stored in a OneDrive, as in my example. We can talk about data that wasn't backed up. Adam hit on very much that backups are very important, because sometimes the backups contain the sensitive data that we thought we disposed of. We want to understand what administrative access was not logged, or was logs turned off in the case of an insider. So you're starting to leverage DSPM to support those use cases as well. But in an incident, you have to cover all the bases. Is it external? Is it internal? And then looking for data drift. We've talked about the privacy rules and how many countries, almost 200 countries, we're approaching the creation of data privacy rules. So as we are global companies and as we are becoming global companies, these become very important to understand the mean time to materiality. And in some cases, it's the mean time to innocence of this is not a reportable, this is not an incident. Also enabling the IR teams to focus on the threat and return to normal operations. In many cases, when we have these disclosures in these situations, our teams are not returned to normal operations for quite some time, which is again costing the business. And then we want to provide the context of the data, going back to the user, the system, the country, the location, the sensitivity. We need to understand all of those aspects to really understand what risk we averted or what implication that we are responsible for. And then I want you to understand that this is really just a pictorial. Everything really starts with data discovery. As you look at how we use and where we store data, it's all across SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, and on-premise. Those are the contexts of where all of our data resources are, a vast majority. But when you look at how you build up to an effective incident response for a data incident, you got to have data discovery. You got to have the classification. And I put AI in there for the reason of, I know everything's using AI, but I put that in there when you look at, you want something that can give you precision and scale to ensure that the classification is much faster, much more centered and effective than having the human do it, because with the data growing the way it is, we can't throw humans at it. We have to be able to have some accuracy and precision around the tools and solutions that we're using to provide that determination. And that gives us to our data posture. And that helps us to have more of an effective an approach for incident response. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Steve, and maybe we can get into some Q&A.
Very good. Thank you very much, Lamont. Excellent presentation. Now we're going to portion of our event, and as a reminder to participate in the Q&A, just type your question into the Ask a Question text box and then hit the submit button. Also want to remind our audience that we have downloadable resources and PDFs of our slides, and we also have a feedback form that we would greatly appreciate your participation. So we do have a few moments, and a number of questions have come in. So I'm going to ask our presenters to take a look and see what they're interested in responding to. First off, I have a question for Adam from Jennifer, who wants to know, so what's the difference between categorization and classification? What would you say?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Steve, because I think there's often a kind of mismatch between the two. It's kind of similar words, kind of meaning the same thing. I think categorization can be boiled down to a data type. And I think the one that's typically referenced is PII, so personally identifiable information. Another data type could be financial information. If the business that you're working in is going through an acquisition, maybe your M&A data could be a data type. Classification takes those data types and defines the sensitivities of each of those particular data types. Now, you could say that all your PII information is sensitive, to be quite arbitrary about it. But actually, when you start drilling down into PII alone, you find that there are different layers, different sensitivities. So not all PII is equal. So to arbitrarily label it in one sense as a single classification is probably a bit too simplistic. So categorization of data is a data type. Classification is a type of sensitivity allocated to each of those types of data. And as I say, you can have very sensitive PII, you can have less sensitive PII. Think of a chief executive salary details, probably more important because it has a bearing on sort of shareholders, investments, and capital, acquisition and so on. Probably more sensitive data than perhaps some of your salary details for some of your sort of junior employees, etc. Probably quite a simplistic example, but certainly categorization, as I think I said in my presentation and came through very strongly in terms of Lamont's presentation, categorization and classification are definitely different, but very important to have a good knowledge of both types.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Jeffrey has a question, I think for Lamont here. Could a DPSM solution assist on determining which data is no longer needed to be retained or archived? What do you think there?
Absolutely. I mean, that is a great question, because when you talk about being able to inventory this data, it's inventorying across every resource that you have. And what we tend to find is there's lots of duplicity of data there. And it went unbeknownst to the organization because, again, our team members are trying to work and do their jobs. And, if it's hard to get to data, as we all know, data's kind of like water. It runs out, it'll find a way. And so it creates this new source. And when you're looking at what the DSPM solution can provide, it'll tell you that. It'll also tell you something that we call ghost data. It's the data that has been believed to have been deleted, but it's still sitting in a repository because maybe someone just disabled the user account of sort, but never got around to deleting the data. And I think those are some immediate cost savings that you have by just doing the right thing and trying to modernize your data security program. You get these other outcomes that are there. And I think even with and I wanted to hit on that categorization and classification comment as well. And I think one piece that separates them is context. When you understand all of those different attributes about where the data is being used, how it's being used, by whom it's being used, you get all of those different attributes that gets you closer to true classification of the data.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze in another question here. let's see. Well, Lamont, how would you start to prepare for an IR event?
So the one thing that, preparation is key. And we can take a page out of something that we've done historically throughout our security and technologies careers. We assess ourselves. And so I think providing an assessment that's focused through a data security lens would be a good start to help you understand where those hotspots are, where you have policies that may not be enforced. Because again, a policy, everybody signs off on it. They understand what they're supposed to do, but in many cases, there's no mechanism to show that it's being enforced. And what I think a data security assessment would do is provide you a view of that horizon and also understand where you need to put controls, such as a DSPM, or where you need to tighten up your policies, or you may have the proper controls and the proper enforcement mechanism in place through another tool, but you didn't know that this repository or this resource with this data even existed. It was ghost, or it was somewhat of a shadow resource that was created.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. Unfortunately, well, let's just see. Perhaps another question came in. Do you see anything? Because going to just be wrapping up about now. If not,
Steve, can I just come in on that last point, because I think Lamont makes an excellent response there, but I think it's also DSPM can absolutely provide the technology, but I think it also has to be worked in harmony with business process and business decision making. It's down to the business really to understand and act upon the various sort of levels of sensitivity within their organization. It will vary according to what that business or organization is. Think about national defense, for example. If not all of their data is highly sensitive and frankly of use to intelligence services, military organizations, and so on. So it's really a question of getting the discovery piece within DSPM, finding the data in the first place, but then working through the business processes to apply the applicable classification labels to that particular, each particular data set. So it's down to technology, absolutely, but it's also business process and business decision making to actually decide which bits of data need to be protected in which particular way.
Okay, great points, Adam. Thanks very much. And another one here from Anthony to Lamont. As privacy regulation grows from GDPR to CPRA, will a DSPM tool like Cyera give data custodians the ability to effectively identify a customer's data and give companies a leg up on property removing data as requested in a timely manner?
Yes, what a loaded question. It actually, this question actually excites me a lot because it gives us the opportunity to bring privacy and security together. Because we're, for many years, it has been separation of church and state. And I think that, Adam actually mentioned some of that in his presentation around the capabilities that the DSPM tools will provide. So when you think of the ability to discover and classify, that's a search function, honestly, at its core. And when you think of what we're doing and answering one side of Anthony's question, we want to understand the data that's subjected to this request and be able to identify it, remove it, extensively give the context as to it was in this database, it was in this line, it was in this area, and be able to mitigate that by removing it in some case, so data disposition, which is again very, very hard for us to do, and there's many ways to do it. But when you have access to those data stores in this way, you 100% can proactively identify that data. Number one, if you're trying to adhere to GDPR or CCPA or CRPA or CPRA, you can identify that data and say, yes, it's in the right place, or no, it's in the wrong place, and be able to proactively mitigate any violation of compliance. But in the event that you actually need to search for this data and remove this data, or identify where all the data exists for a particular person in a particular country or source by some sort of request, you absolutely already have that access to those systems, and you can identify it, you can mark it, you can figure out what the next action is to dispose of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeffrey's back with another question about what is the percentage of data sources or silos that contain valuable or relevant data are often overlooked by organizations? Who'd like to take that?
I can address that one if you like.
Thanks.
So it varies, is the brutal truth. You know, it depends on the industry, it depends on the environment, it depends on the sensitivities of all of the data. There's no kind of one size, you know, in terms of the data that's sensitive versus confidential versus publicly acceptable. It's really down to the business to make those decisions. But the important thing is to find all of your data, and then you can make a decision based on the knowledge of the true extent of your data landscape. And just to pick up on the last point in terms of GDPR, CPRA, and so on, you can't protect what you don't know you have. So you need to find out what is retained within the entirety of your data landscape, on-prem, SaaS applications, cloud, whatever, and then you can make some decisions as to the labels that you want to apply to it in terms of sensitivity, and then obviously it can be protected in the right way. Regulators want to see data protected, and so if you can provide a sort of an audit trail in terms of protecting that data, then you can probably remove yourself from the crosshairs in terms of fines. But, you know, to address the question, really, it's down to the business to make the decision as to where the pockets of sensitive information are, and then work accordingly based on the thorough knowledge that DSPM will provide.
If I may come in on this question as well, I'll give you a little food for thought. If you look at a recent Forrester survey as well, they had a very impactful measurement there that says 59% cannot maintain a detailed data inventory. So really, back to Adam's point, it depends on the organization. But what this does highlight is that 59% of organizations are having this trouble. So you can think, you can extrapolate that and really view that it's a problem. And many of those silos do go unlooked, untouched, and not maintained in a way that will keep you in compliance, or at least help you identify where you may have security exposures.
Sorry about that. I wanted just to let the audience know that we want to ask you to please complete the feedback form, check out the resources in our documents, and download PDFs of those if you could. We want to thank you for your time and fill out our feedback form, and for attending today's Black Hat webinar, Defeating the Dangers of a Data Breach, Top Strategies to Get Your Organization Ahead of a data security incident. Brought to you by Cyera, Black Hat, and Informa. Shortly after this live event, we'll send you an email so you can access this presentation on demand. And on behalf of our guests, Adam Strange of Omdia and Lamont Orange of Cyera, we want to thank you for your time and have a great day.